The Puzzle Jug. Friday, July 4th, 1856. The Uncles at the Pit. Hannibal was deeply absorbed in what proved to be his final self-flagellation when the scene he'd played out so many times in his waking moments, and his dreaming ones as well, floated up before his eyes. The tableau laid out there in front of him didn't look real. Tiny figures sloshed around in the distance, as if they were blue and red foam in a bucket. The yard in front of the White House was boiling over with more people than he'd ever seen gathered together in one place. Massa Lamar and Mousa's Sarah lived there. The big White House had its own name like it was a living person. Hannibal remembered his mama told him that one time. She used to stay up here too, tending to their young'uns.
I stay up at the Masters. It be called Woodlawn Plantation.
Unbidden, her voice and hands and breath came flying towards him, riding on the back of dangerous emotions. Hannibal's recollection etched the outline of her lips as she spoke.
I come up here to wait for you, Hanny.
He'd slipped into a chasm where he met his mother's ghost and realized she'd told him the name of this place so she'd be with him right now, today.
Look at you, son. Big as a giant. Just look at you.
His feet stopped moving as his mother's face materialized more solidly, overlaying the scene before him. He wasn't unaccustomed to her visits. She was known to come on him like that sometimes, strong and insistent. He wanted to honor the gravity of her appearance as encouragement to raise him up during these last few yards of his sojourn. But missing her now, in the deep way that sometimes brought a black curtain down on him, was going to hobble his man's mission. He closed his eyes, asked her ghost to return later when he could find a private piece of time to sink into remembering her properly. Up here, on this hill, she'd waited for him to come. Being raised up as a child to a man in only a day was bound to bring her back to him. She knew he couldn't cry now. She retreated, and as she did, he promised her that the top of this rise where they could view the past and the future together would be where they'd meet from now on. The covenant made, Hannibal strode more calmly than he thought he would into the fog of smoke created by smoldering coals and fire-blistered pork skin. A familiar odor of perspiring men was hovering in there too, supplying the final injection of fortitude he needed. He was grateful for it. Sidestepping the densest clouds of smoke, Hannibal beheld his first glimpse of the annual ceremony into which he was being initiated. His four uncles lined one side of a giant split in the field that was partially shaded by a massive oak, probably bigger than any he'd ever seen before. The elders, each who'd spent the past months preparing Hannibal for this rite of passage, were looking over the 4 or 5 foot deep crevice from which a mixture of low pops and fizzles emanated. 2 young men, not yet 20, stood on the other side of the pit poking at the coals. He knew them very well. He recognized their faces better than his own. They were brothers to him. The Swamp Plantation village was a tightly woven family of about 30 souls, who were intimately acquainted with the demeanors and natures of their own. Yet, he now saw those very faces that he'd watched contort while wrangling livestock, crumble when sorrowing over the loss of kin, wince while hauling timber to the steamboat woodyard, laugh when fooling on each other, swell with fever and lock up with bitter cold, standing like drivers alongside the smoldering slash of earth. Both of them were stripped naked to the waist, save for what looked like a leather skirt tied across their groins. He studied them, but still barely recognized them. Emblazoned in the center of each tanned wrap they wore was an odd cipher that Hannibal made out to be one bowl with a wedged-shaped chunk removed from the middle of it, balancing atop another, mirroring its outline. His eyes searched the sweating stone masks their familiar faces had become as they turned towards him. The fire ants returned and rose up in his gut in response to an ancient fierceness coming out of them. The revelation of it nearly dissolved the legs beneath him. He deemed it possible his body would soon lie headless next to the hogs he'd named Crackle and Honey, presently halved from neck to tail. He'd been charged with raising them since Christmas. That was the day Granny Venus had held him on her lap in her willow rocker and began telling him the story of Thomas Peters. No stories could have prepared him for the scene he was beholding. At the precise moment his worn-out knees finally failed to support his body from there up, his Uncle Ned caught him under his elbows.
All's us men here been where you be right now, son.
Ned's assurance didn't banish all the dread pushing down on him, but he leaned in towards what was offered. He tried to force his mind back to the evenings he'd spent with his uncles, Ned, Gilbert, Jack, and James. They were generally comfortable gatherings, where the men drilled deep into details of what their lives had been like when they were young men. The cabin walls would dissolve as they told about the Georgia woods across the river, with trails that led to the villages of the Chickasaw and Creek. The men filled his imagination with visions of places that seemed impossible to have ever existed, where Buckra, black and Indian folk, stood blood kin to each other and spoke 3 or 4 languages all mixed together. His uncles used the entire inside of the cabin to act out the dramas of their near-deadly encounters with creatures and men as they roamed all the way from the old Silver Bluff trading post down to the ocean. Their eyes would sometimes tear up as they remembered being gone for 2 months at a time from the swamp village, sometimes more. They'd float their masses' goods down the river in pole boats to the ports of Savannah, where their cargo was loaded up on wagons and transferred to huge ships bound for lands across the sea. Laced within those recollections of high adventure were the grievous reports of unlucky men who were rounded up in one of those foreign places, only to be crowded into a pen, to be cargo themselves, in ships that sailed them away. His uncles saw some women, and even young'uns too, driven like livestock down the streets of Savannah. They'd have metal collars around their necks, with chains attaching one of them to another. They never even saw animals treated so poorly, or so piteously, their skin pulled over the outline of their bones. All those folks had lived with their uncles and mothers and kin in a land called Africa, where the swamp plantation village people had first come from, where Thomas Peters, in Granny Venus's story, came from too. Uncle James learned some words from their language. He knew the words for water, because they were all very thirsty. Uncle James knew a word for food, too.
Them folks is our folks.
But nobody could help them without worry of getting strapped or caught up by mistake to be sold to the Buckra.
Buckra folks come to this land here free to roam all over the country, from one end to the other. But brown folks can't go where they want to because their skin color gives them away. They got masters keeping them fearing for their kin, telling them what they gonna do and when it gonna happen. It just ain't fair nor fitting.
That's what his uncles said every time they finished those stories. Those sad folks wasn't all from the same villages. They came from lots of different ones, but got rounded up somehow to end up on the same ship together.
Them folks be our folks.
The only difference between the ladies, passing in their carriages with their lace hankies held to their noses to block out the sickening smell that came along with 400 humans packed like sausage in the casing, or the men that prodded them onto the pier, was their skin color. His uncles made Hannibal say,
Everybody got a right to be free. Independent. That's what they called it.
His uncles prepared him that the sight he would witness when he topped the hill where the White House was in view was the past, present, and future tied up into one celebration called Independence Day. This particular day, when he carried the spices brought from Africa and the water of the ancestors to the hog cooking pit, was about those people who wasn't independent. They were, we are, slaves. Slaves meant everyone Hannibal loved. Those who looked after him and protected him was like a dog with a rope around its neck. All of them, all of us. Not able to go where we want and forced to stay put in the swamp village, wedged in between Horse Creek and the river. It was their home, and they was tied to it, whether they chose to be or not. Choice has a lot to do with independence. Hannibal hardly knew where he began and ended except that parcel of dirt and water. Now, though, through his recently created man's eyes, he began to perceive a different sort of outline taking shape. He'd traveled farther today than ever before in his life. Whatever was outside the triangle formed by the back pasture of the village, Horse Creek, and the river, except for Sunday meetings at Storm Branch with Granny Venus, had been strictly off-limits to him. Everyone, including his mama, had filled his head up with tales of Mami Wata and the boogeyman. He was warned he'd be shanghaied away from the village, and until this day, it was a prospect that haunted his imagination. Now that he'd crossed over, traveled the forbidden path to witness the rituals of his brothers and uncles, a sensation rose in him that scattered the demons. He wanted to know what was inside the massa's woodlawn house. Boards nailed together that had a name like a man does must also be hiding something wondrous inside it. The idea spread out from there like ripples on the creek. He suddenly craved to wander farther past it, to see the forest across the river, to learn to speak the jumbled languages of the Indians, to board ships bound for strange and mysterious places. The notions descended all at once, sending a tremor through his entire body for which he had no comparison. Hannibal's gaze shifted up from the smoldering slash of blistered earth to the bustling tumble of noisy white people cackling against the backdrop of woodlawn. In a whisper, indistinguishable from a puff of wind, he heard a chorus made up from the voices of Granny Venus, his uncles, the wooden steps, and his mother ask, "Wonder what's out there, beyond the massa's house." The die had been cast. The nail was set. Hannibal had caught it. The ambition to be free was now etched into his soul, past the curtain of his flesh, deep in his bone, and in spite of the afflictions it may be subject to endure. It awakened in him a creeping curiosity. Hannibal inhaled his first breath, steeped with the ache of its intrigue. He brought the smell of it into his lungs, just as they did. The men's attention was squarely on the boy. Sloshed, Storm Branch Creek water had baptized him into the brotherhood with each step up the hill from the church to the pit. There were years when their course of careful preparation didn't take. They'd have to make the gamble, then stand here and merely hope as they surveyed the face of the boy they'd chosen to make the ultimate determination that no transformation caught him. They hadn't celebrated a liberty ceremony for 6 Julys, not since Amos was of age. He hadn't caught it, although he'd made it this far, and, bless his soul, he was a willing learner. They never failed to see a promising spark in Amos's eyes. He was enthralled by their stories of being free, and of the years they roamed the woods and the river without worry. Amos had progressed well through all the sacraments, receiving the Ifo from Granny Venus, fetching the Storm Branch water, showing up exactly at the appointed time. Yet no spark caught, no revelation, no ripening. That was a hard day. Harder, in fact, for the uncles than having no liberty ceremony at all. It wasn't Amos's fault, though. They couldn't blame him. They constantly struggled to find the right balance between expressing their compassion and acknowledging the harsh reality of the cruelty they were enduring in silence. This was the commandment from Granny Venus, who had lived all the pieces of it: joy, loss, violence, humiliation, love, and liberty. It was she who raised them to know how to unite the unyielding, sucking swamp mud and the domination of white men with every living thing's right to mercy and might. The boy chosen for the changing ceremony could only grasp that moral steadiness through a constant demonstration of loving kindness, as deep and unwavering as the river itself. In all, it had been 9 years since Liberty had caught. That had been Caleb who stood with them right now, dressed in his hog leather loincloth that was branded with a Fawohodi. James, Ned, and Jack searched each other's expressions, making sure what each of them suspected was true. Like the instant between a jump and a landing, they were all suspended in the bright realization. Finally, Ned silently mouthed,
He caught it.